we have Jeanne Trabulsi here with us today. She will be talking about how Jewish Israeli lobbies infiltrate the U.S. education system. And just a little bit of background, Jeanne has spent her career in education, communications, and public relations. She is presently a coordinator of the Education Committee of the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, and has taught at the university and K-12 levels for over 15 years, I'm sorry. She is the founder of the Refugee Doll Project. The project is partnered with the Welcoming Library, a public collection of acclaimed picture books that feature new arrival and new American families. The portable library travels between schools, public libraries, and community centers in Virginia to build an environment of welcoming and belonging. And as well, we have Saeed Ariqat, who will be moderating the event. Welcome, Saeed. Thank you for being with us here today. Again, and I will hand it off to Jeanne. If you.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Oh my. Can you hear me? Sorry about that. We had a lot of difficulties this afternoon, and we appreciate you bearing with us. Of course, I want to welcome you. This is definitely an area that I, for one, not familiar with, especially at the level of curriculums. I have been confronted in the past a number of times by U.S. congressmen and other on television shows and so on about the Palestinian curriculum, in occupied Palestine being anti-Jewish, even anti-Semitic, and so on, or something that advocates for violence. I know I had a very heated discussion on a couple of occasions with former Congressman Elliot Engels, who absolutely knew nothing and was not familiar with Palestinian curriculum, but was parroting out words that were drafted, or talking points that were drafted by AIPAC. So I really look forward to listening to what you have to say, learning from it, and the same thing with our audience. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Firas, if you could put up the slide deck, please. Thank you. So on behalf of the Education Committee of the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, I am pleased to tell you about our work to counter proposed edits of Virginia history textbooks by an organization called ICS, or the Institute for Curriculum Services. Next slide, please. Because building background is the key to learning new information, here's a brief summary of how we became aware of ICS. In 2018, we saw this notice. It's an interview of ICS Director Kramer Elias with the President of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. In it, we learned that ICS is a nonprofit organization founded in 2005, dedicated to improving the quality of K-12 education on Jews, Judaism, and Israel. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
And now, what is their impact nationwide? This is directly from their website. In the webcast, we learned that ICS has trained more than 6,000 teachers in more than 90 cities. Some 11 million students in 50 states have been exposed to its curricula. Most alarming was the statement made by Kramer Elias when she described working behind the scenes with textbook publishers and claimed that these publishers come to ICS to work with them on manuscripts before publication. VCHR is of the opinion that ICS is not a true education outfit We believe it's a public affairs and advocacy group. Let's see the evidence, please. Next slide. Evidence number 1. This is also from the ICS website. ICS operates under the auspices of the Jewish Community Relations Council of San Francisco, JCRC. ICS is financially structured under the 501c3 status of JCRC. And when you write a check to ICS, you have to make it out to JCRC, and on the memo line, you write ICS. You see the yellow highlights there.
Yeah.
And the stated purpose of this JCRC in San Francisco, in their brochure, they say that they are public relations and that they recognize Israel's integral role in modern Jewish identity and articulates its commitment to Zionism in the Bay Area's Jewish community. Next slide, please. Evidence number 2. That's the Schusterman Family Foundation. They're the group that takes all the freshman congressmen to Israel every year. ICS, you'll see in the yellow, is a grantee of the Schusterman Family Foundation. In sum, we believe that ICS is enmeshed with and funded by Israel advocacy groups, Israel affinity groups that drive their pro-Israel advocacy. We believe this results in biased and inaccurate textbooks. Let's take a look at ICS tactics for teacher training. Now, this again is from the ICS website. Here you'll see 3 modules, teaching modules, which they offer free of charge to teachers. They also pay teachers a stipend. Latest that I looked at was $150 if you attend the course on the Arab-Israeli conflict. They also give you a letter that you can give to your principal asking for continuing education credits. And their signature course is the first one on the left, the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I attended. They use a teaching method that focuses exclusively on primary sources. So they get the documents themselves and they have a class discussion with the Hussein McMahon Accord and so forth and so on. But they are highly selective, Saeed, about what documents they use. They don't use the 1939 British paper that says that you cannot have a homeland in Palestine. They don't bring that one up. Yeah. So if you didn't know, Saeed, about the history world, you'd be very confused. You'd think that one student said, you know, the Israelis have offered peace so many times to the Arabs. What else could the Arabs possibly want? Next slide. This is an example of one of their textbook edits. In addition to teacher training, they propose edits to these textbooks for Virginia's last cycle. ICS proposed many edits for 12 textbooks. Here's an example of one found in the World History textbook published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Now, the original text read, after the word change you see in bold, ongoing conflict over Israeli occupied territories. But the proposed ICS change would read, ongoing conflict over Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza. Saeed, do you see where they crossed out the phrase occupied territories?
Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I see that quite, it's obvious. Now, in what stage, I mean, I'm sorry, but you sort of raised a very important point. Is this being, has it changed? Is it being processed to be changed? Where is it in terms of adoption? this language.
Oh, I see. Well, as far as we know, these changes were not adopted.
No, we're not.
And I'll get to that to further
Right, yeah.
on the slides. So if you read the comments, so for every edit, ICS put a comment.
Right.
They say that the term occupied territories is a politicized term which is inappropriate for a public school text. The text should use the phrase the West Bank and Gaza, which is politically neutral and geographically accurate. Next slide, please. Go back to the last one. Yeah. And so what they did was they put all of these edits together, and they gave them to 3 JCRCs, 2 of whom were in Virginia. And these JCRCs wrote a letter to the Virginia Department of Education. ICS did not send the letter. These 3 JCRCs, you'll be able to see them. They've been enlarged in yellow. The Jewish Community Federation of Richmond, United Jewish Federation of Tidewater, and the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. In it, we see also in yellow on the top that these leaders thank the Virginia Department for making past ICS edits. In particular, we would like to thank Pearson and McGraw-Hill for the many improvements made to their textbooks made on earlier IC recommendations. So you have to know that the textbooks now are in pretty bad shape because of the edits that were adopted 7 years ago. Next slide, please. And so we pushed back. When we discovered, we were shocked and dismayed, and then we decided to logically have a response. And so we organized them into themes such as sanitizing language, Arab culpability for everything, discouraging students from conducting open internet research, changing labels on maps, and deleting all references to Palestine. Next slide, please. And so this is how we categorized and organized this fact sheet. We felt we needed to present it in a matrix like this. On the left, you'll see the theme. Everywhere that ICS saw the word Palestine, that was not allowed. It had to be mandatory Palestine or another kind of Palestine, but not a state or not the designation of a territory. So everywhere they saw the word Israel and Palestine, they wanted the textbook publisher to change it to Israel and the Palestinians. And their reasoning was there is no state of Palestine, nor has there ever been one. That's a direct quote. And we then state the problems we have with the edit on the right-hand column. Palaset, Philistine, and Palestina have been used to reference the region since 1150 BC. Currently, over 70% member states of the UN have recognized the state of Israel. Next slide. This is our review committee. As I said, Saeed, the textbooks were in already bad shape because
Right.
seven years ago, see, our textbook review cycle is every 7 years. 7 years ago, they had sent in edits unbeknownst to us. And so we thought, well, not just opposing IC edits, but we also had to do something with the current textbook as it is. And we needed Virginia scholars because they would carry most weight with the Virginia officials. And so we called these people at the various universities in Virginia. And thankfully, we have a lot of Middle East departments in Virginia universities. And you see some of the people here,
I know.
many of whom are luminaries.
Right.
Lawrence Wilkerson, of course, Chief of Staff of Colin Powell, William Quandt, a National Security Advisor for President Jimmy Carter. Peter Mandeville was Senior Policy Advisor for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And our scholars, Nora Erakat and Stephen Sheehy, Feda Tote, Bassem Haddad, and Sheila Carapico. Next slide.
I know many of them.
So you must be heartened to see that these people were willing to give their time and support to us.
Right.
These are the textbooks that we reviewed. As I said, ICS reviewed 12 of them. We just picked the most egregious examples. And I will talk about some of these. With access to digital copies of these books, we found a selection of text that was problematic. And we sent these digital copies to all of these scholars. And if you go to the next slide, Firas, you'll see we gave them a graphic organizer, and then these scholars would put in the problematic passage on the top, and then they would give their rationale. This is from topic 12, the passage from Gaza. Hamas launched frequent rocket attacks on Israel. The Israeli military responded with airstrikes and several invasions. And this is what Dr. Kwan said. Once again, the text implies parity. In fact, Israeli attacks on Gaza were massive, resulting in thousands of casualties, and Hamas attacks on Israel resulted in many fewer casualties. So these edits by the scholars were sent to the department and to the publishers. And to our knowledge, no ICS edits were incorporated in the Virginia textbooks. Next slide. And that's a picture of me speaking in front of the Budget Committee of the General Assembly in Roanoke, Virginia. We were upset that they were spending so much money on textbooks that were flawed. And the other things that we have done, besides creating a press release, testifying before the board, General Assembly, we've been on the Electric Intifada and Miko Pellet's show, and we've reached out to other communities who are marginalized, whose stories are not told in textbooks. Specifically the African American History Education Commission. We've reached out to the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, the members of which opposed 2 Pearson textbooks and had them withdrawn. Apparently the teachers' unions in Britain are very powerful. And so that was really a major win. And we are working with them. There's a scholar in Britain now who is trying to document all the interference by the Israeli lobby in textbooks. Next slide. And this is who we are. Here's our website. You can email us at this VA Coalition 4HR@gmail.com. And our website link is vchr.org, where you can find videos and documents, including the fact sheet. Under educational resources, teachers may access a wealth of information. And where do we go from here? We are now collecting high quality instructional materials on the Middle East for distribution to state agencies and school districts. What's happening in Virginia is they realize teachers are spending an inordinate amount of time searching on the internet for relevant materials. And so they're thinking of maybe not going away with textbooks, but they're thinking of producing materials besides textbooks. They're called high quality information materials, or HQIM. And we are also planning to co-host a teacher training institute next summer to introduce teachers to the new history standards of learning for the history textbooks. I'd like to speak about this a little bit later.
Please.
Write that down, Saeed.
Yeah.
SOLs, standards of learning. That's another review cycle. It's another very important thing for our friends to know about, because these standards of learning drive the textbooks. Every state has a different standard for different grades, different subjects, and our friends listening really have to know what standards of learning are in their state. Other things you can do to ensure accurate textbooks in your state: find out when are the cycles for your textbook review, when are the cycles of the standards of learning review, how is your Department of Education organized, who heads the Social Studies office, find allies, organize, and push back. The other thing before I forget, and I hope Fidas will put this in the chat, is this is an article that just came out about the Institute for Curriculum Studies and how is an Israeli lobby group infiltrated US education. It's written by Jessica Buxbaum. It's called The Mint Press, and it was published on May the 4th.
Okay.
And she,
We'll put the link. Huh? Please. Yeah, put the link online.
she FOIA'd 50 states, all 50 states, asking for information, what kind of correspondence they had had with ICS. And only 5 states responded to her. But if you are in the states of Kentucky, California, New Mexico, Louisiana, South Carolina, this is a heads up. ICS has already done a lot of work in your state. So if you read this article, you will find out what they have done. That's really all I have, Fidas and Saeed. I hope that has just given you the background and in the beginning of the context. We've been doing this for 2-3 years now, and we're always surprised that people are surprised that this is going on. We were surprised initially, but now it's sort of like, you know, we know. But I want to thank both of you so much for giving us the ability to tell other people about this and to ask them to do a little bit of homework and find out what's going on in their own state.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is really a learning experience for me, you know, probably many others, because I did not know all these details. I mean, you raised a lot of questions in my mind that I'd like to ask, but I'm not going to burden you with many. Just to clarify, you mentioned something that really struck me, you know, sort of raised my antenna, so to speak, about the freshman congressmen and women that apparently are sponsored by the Schusterman Family Foundation, the Schusterman Family Foundation, because we know that AIPAC does that. So there must be, you know, a real connection between AIPAC and the Schusterman Family Foundation. I know that the majority leader in the House, Steny Hoyer, is a huge advocate of these strips, and he takes them every year after every new term. He takes his the new freshman and goes. And you know, a couple of years ago in 2018, there was a big deal about or 2019 because that's when they went. He took a group of freshmen. Then the Israelis disallowed Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, if you recall at the time. Netanyahu did that at the behest of the American president, Donald Trump at the time. So this is really very intriguing. So we know them. I mean, one can draw that there is a connection between AIPAC and ICS for sure. You know, They probably fund them. You talked about the Jewish community in San Francisco. I am familiar with their activities. Many years ago, I actually went to USF for my undergrad and so on. So they have been around for a very long time. They're active, and they raise a lot of funds. I just want you to explain to me, if you can. I know you did, but I'm still a bit muddy on how do they go about contacting a school district or a school in particular, and so on. What are what is their methodology? What is their methodical steps? If you can explain that to us.
Well, they're very well organized and they're very well funded. So you said Schusterman gives them $200,000 a year. I don't know the exact relationship with Schusterman and APEC, but you connect the dots.
Right, but APAC is actually quite proud to say we finance these trips. So there is definitely a connection.
Well, what I understand is that ICS does what anyone can do, is they find out when the history textbook reviews are coming up in every state. They probably do not do every state, but I can tell you they do Texas, because the way Texas goes is the way the rest of the nation goes, because they buy the largest amount. And I heard, or they said in that, remember the webcast that I showed you on the first slide, that they got $1 million, and years before that review was coming about, they were working on Texas. In other words, they had their people assigned to the textbooks, going through them, and so forth and so on. They participate, as other organizations and the public can do, by first of all, knowing how to access the review process. Mm-hmm. And many departments are not that transparent, but they are, very good researchers. And they knew, for instance, when the Virginia textbook review cycle was coming up, and they got the digital copies of all of the textbooks that would interest them. I'm not sure where they went to elementary books, but probably just middle grades and high school. And they had their team there go through those digital copies and make the edits, as you saw. And then they gave the edits to, my guess is that the 3 federations in Virginia funded this. Right. Funded this, but I don't know that. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Right. Yeah. Well, it largely does. I have many other questions, but let me ask you: they target only public schools, or do they actually do private schools? Are you aware?
I don't know that.
Okay. We don't know, but there's some sort of an effort to do that, because I think if there is an initiative to change curriculum, one would expect that they would target all schools and so on of learning, with a focus on public schools, because that's where the larger body of students are. Now, I know in the beginning, there was a mention, of course, that they talk about Judaism and probably Jews in America and so on. Do they actually give that? I mean, for instance, there's a great deal of anti-Semitic acts in America and so on. Is there like a thrust on their part to focus on that issue, or is it, for mainly the politically driven to support the state of Israel?
Focus on what? Focus
on combating anti-Semitism, on things like this in school curriculums or anything like that.
As far as combating anti-Semitism, that would work its way through the edits that they propose.
Right. Okay.
I'm just trying to think of a specific edit that I saw that would combat anti-Semitism.
Right. Yeah.
I don't remember those exact words.
Yeah.
But the thrust of it would be through the edits that they propose.
So yeah, one would assume really from looking at there, and I would have to do more research or read a little more, about this, one would assume that their thrust and their focus is political and it's anti-Palestinian. I mean, we saw in your presentations where the word Palestine, for instance, there was an effort to replace it or put next to it mandatory Palestine, or going back to the original name and so on. The fact that Israel is recognized by so many states and at the UN and all these things. They are obviously philosophically and organizationally opposed to anything that could connote in any way a sort of an independence or a statehood for the Palestinians. I mean, you mentioned in the history background how there is no mention of the white papers, for instance, and things like this. But I still I'm a bit I'm not clear on how they go about approaching it. And so I'm sure that they do have bodies of research. They determine a school and they go to change it. And like you said, this is a 50-state effort. I understood you correctly, right?
They say it's 50 states, but you see, yeah. I would think that they would focus on the most important states.
Right.
But I don't really know that.
Right, like Texas, California,
right.
California.
I can read you, getting back to the other question,
right.
This article is so fascinating because she FOIA'd these 50 states.
Right.
And she was able to read the ICS proposed edits in Kentucky and Louisiana and the rest of it. And some of them are a little different than the ones in Virginia, but some of them actually get to the heart of what you just asked, Saeed.
Right.
In California, delete mentions of Palestine and the West Bank, but change Palestine to Judea,
right?
The ancient Israeli kingdom.
Right. Right.
See, that was a new one for me. I hadn't heard that one. Delete reference to Palestinian cultural heritage.
Right.
Change Jews settle there to Jews join those Jews already there.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So, completely erasing Palestine and heritage to, in essence, that the Jews have already been there, right?
Right.
And as you said before, delete natives of Palestine in definition of Palestinians. Delete references to Palestinians inhabiting the land for thousands of years.
Right.
That's in the Louisiana one.
Yeah.
So it doesn't exactly get out what you were asking, but you get the drift, I think.
No, I know. Now it is very clear. And, there's a large connection. I mean, I look at also the time frame and so on. We all remember that in 2019 and early in 2020, the Trump administration stopped using the term occupied completely, and in fact used communities instead of settlers and so on. They did that, so they have, in a way, their influence obviously, transcends just the schools and the campuses and so on, and went right into politics. And they have obviously great many advocates like the former American ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, and so on, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, for sure. I mean, I confronted him one time on this issue, and we went back and forth. And he said that the term "occupied" is politically incorrect. In fact, they never used officially Judea and Samaria, for instance, what Israel does and how it refers to the West Bank and so on, but they nullified the term occupied. So in essence, these things go hand in hand.
Yes, I see.
Yeah.
Before we get to the other questions, I did want to mention the SOLs, the standards of learning. I talked about it a little bit.
Right, next on my issue of questions. Go ahead,
If I
please.
may, because these
Right,
books
yeah.
are driven by what is called the standards of learning. We call it SOLs.
Right,
The SOLs are important because the publishers look at them, and with them in hand, they write the textbooks using them. So there's no textbooks without an SOL because they want to get the state to buy the textbook.
right,
So every state makes their own standards of learning. For an example, a standard of learning for fourth grade history.
yeah,
A student cannot leave fourth grade. Students will be able to know, for instance, that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. You've got to know that by the end of fourth grade.
right,
In Virginia, in music, there's SOLs in music. Students will be able to know what a 16th note is. You cannot leave the fourth grade if you don't know what a 16th note is. In math, students will be able to know the meaning of translation in geometry. So there are SOLs for every subject, for every grade, K through 12. That's why it's such a tremendous task to do this. I urge all of our friends out there to go to your education website and download your history SOLs for grades 3 to 12.
right.
Now, SOLs have a review cycle just like textbooks do. It just so happens Virginia SOLs are every 7 years.
Okay,
It just so happens Virginia SOLs are being approved right now.
right,
In July, the SOLs will be presented to the Virginia Board of Education for the first review, and then in November, they'll be accepted. The SOL review process is a little different from the textbook because there are committees that are composed of historians.
right,
Textbooks do not have historians vet that material. So the SOL process is different. I don't want to get you too confused, but what I want to do is leave you with one example for how important the SOLs are. An example of a current SOL, what Virginia students are being taught now. This is world history, and they have to give each SOL a number. So this is World History 2.14D, that students will be able to analyze the impact of terrorism. And underneath that is the essential knowledge, what every student has to know. Every student has to know these examples of terrorism. The Munich Olympics,
yeah,
terrorist attacks in the US motivated by Osama bin Laden, car bombs, suicide bombers, and airline hijackers. So what we did is we got all of our groups together because there's a way that publics can input their ideas for how the SOL should be edited. And of course, we said you have to remove all the bias of Arab and Muslim only attacks. Why don't you list the 1995 bombing
yes,
in Oklahoma? And why don't you list the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel? So you see where we're going with this? You got to
Yes,
look at the
yeah.
SOLs too, Saeed.
right, right,
So it's a
I
lot
know.
of work. You've got to get people who are willing to
Right.
work. But all you really
Right.
need is 2 people. I can tell you, we started with 2 people, 2 teachers. You
Yeah.
got to get a public school teacher on your committee who knows the language and knows what to do.
Right. Now, I know you mentioned that it's like these SOLs are every 7 years, at least in Virginia, right? Is that the way it is in all states, every 7
Oh,
years,
yeah.
or it varies?
Every state is different.
Okay, every state is different. And normally it's a group of historians that do this, or how is there a committee? Are they chosen by the Board of Education? How does one become a member of these people that go through determining the SOL?
If you're talking only about the SOL Review Committee,
Right.
Virginia does it every 7 years, but see,
Right.
Virginia is a wealthy state. We
Right.
can buy new textbooks every 7 years.
Right.
Other states cannot.
Yeah.
So every state is different, but you're asking about the review process for SOLs. It is different than the textbook one.
Right.
Their process is they have a committee of historians, they have a committee of educators, they have a committee of students, they have a committee of outside people like museums,
Right.
and other organizations. And you have to try to get your scholar on these committees.
Right. But I'm still, on how are they chosen, the committee, the review committee? How are they picked or chosen? Are they government employees? Are they, the state government employees?
My understanding is that the Virginia Department of Education puts out a request for names. For instance, for the educator committee, they put out a standard and uniform request district-wide to request for names. Who wants to be on the SOL committee?
Right.
And so they get names for the educator committee. There's even a student committee. My understanding is they put out a request, the department does, to ask what students want to be on the committee. As far as getting the historians, I can tell you what we did. We nominated, or we asked that several people we know be considered to be on the historian committee. And we wrote directly to the social studies department of the Virginia Department of Education. I would imagine every department, every state has a different process.
Right. Because it's all too fascinating. I mean, you mentioned, let's say, on slavery, that by the 4th grade, students should know that the Civil War was the cause. I mean, slavery was the cause of the Civil War, And even in states like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and so on. So that is standardized across country. Is there a federal supervision to this?
No, there's not. Every state has its own different SOLs.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. But you mentioned something like about the teaching every 4th grade student, they should know that slavery caused the Civil War.
That is state mandated. Virginia did that.
Okay.
Virginia did that. However, there have been attempts to make a nationwide, a standard SOL.
Right.
They're called common.
Okay.
Every year there's a new bell and there's a new whistle. Okay, every year there's a new idea. There has been an attempt to have a nationwide standard. But my understanding is that it's left up to the states.
Right. Okay, let me ask you, I mean, you raised so many fascinating issues and I have 1,000 questions, honestly, but I want to be as specific as I can. Now, do they speak about, let's say, the history of the Arab countries? And I'm talking about the ICS. Do they say, they mention, or how do they approach the Camp David Accord, for instance, or the Wadi Araba Accord between Egypt and between Jordan and Israel in 1994? I wonder if that is being taught. I wonder if the Oslo process in any way, shape, or form is being taught, or they go about it, or go about explaining it.
It's a very good question. I am going to send you World History Study standards so you yourself can go through them.
I would love to. Yes, absolutely.
Because I do not know the answers to those questions, but I can guarantee it's a pro-Israeli narrative, or they simply just delete it, don't have it.
Yes.
For instance, when they talk about the Renaissance, for instance, go back to 15th century, or they would not mention, for instance, that it was due to the brilliant Arab scholars and translators in Baghdad in what was it, the 11th century, that there even was a Renaissance. It's a very Eurocentric narrative.
Yeah, more than likely it's Zionist-centric, not only Eurocentric.
Right, exactly.
Because,
yeah.
I mean, that's, look, there are a strong advocacy group, it is obvious. And there are many other Israeli lobby groups that are also very strong and have very formidable advocacy programs, and they have a lot of funds to do it. Now, you mentioned something phenomenal, 6,000 students, 6,000 teachers, 11 million students, and so on. That's really phenomenal. That's a huge amount, and that would have a lot of impact. So how did we get these figures?
Well, this is from their website.
That is from their website.
Yes.
Okay.
That's from the website.
Right. Yeah.
I do want to mention that, Virginia is a unique case, I believe.
Right.
We have a Republican governor now. Things are vastly changing.
Right.
There was, of course, more inclusivity and diversity under Governor Northam.
Right.
He invited the African American community in, and he allowed them to completely revamp the history standards of learning for African Americans so that their history became part of and integrated into colonial history and Virginia history. And that whole webpage has been taken down. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. That's why we're all looking and waiting for the new standards of learning in July. Now, you have to remember also that there are great grandsons of Robert E. Lee and George Washington who live next door to us. And whenever they try to change anything, the family members come up and they protest in front of the Board of Education. So there's a lot of different things going on, education.
Like when they're taking, I assume, like when they're taking down the statutes and so on like this. Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think Stonewall Jackson has a very strong family that's still around and so on. Now, I want to ask you about something that you mentioned, if I understood you correctly. You said you attended one of these. They pay a stipend to the participant, the teachers, correct?
Well, they do now. That's current. They used to pay a stipend.
That's correct. So they
didn't.
Okay.
And now they do. They pay
now
a stipend.
They do again.
They pay a stipend for attending the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a 3-day.
Right.
And they pay $150, which is very unusual. Very unusual.
Right. And you mentioned something like it's 99% reflected. 99%, I believe you used the figure 99% of that, what they learn in this course gets taught.
I forget what that meant. I think it was 99% of the people really liked it. Was that what it was? Oh yeah, that's what it was.
That's why. Yeah, I mean, it was they basically espouse whatever or adopt whatever was said in the course. Now, you attended one? You say you attended one? Okay. Tell us about your own experience in attending.
Well, like I say, if you didn't know much about the modern Middle East, I happened to receive a degree in the modern Middle East from the American University of Beirut. And so, I mean, I know a little something. It was a long time ago, but I know when I'm not seeing the whole picture. It was, I think it was it 5 weeks long? It was 5 weeks long.
5 weeks.
Attended by about 10 people, most of whom knew very little about the modern Middle East.
Right.
And it was, you could say, basic. And if you didn't know about the Middle East, you wouldn't see any problem at all with it. You know, like I say, they used primary sources, and what they did was they talked about the promises that were made to the Arab people and the
Right.
promises that were made to the Jewish people,
Right.
both of which were broken by the colonial powers. That's what I think that was sort of the heart.
Yeah. So is there any kind of relations between ICS and evangelicals? You know, it's just a thought that occurred to me, evangelical group, because they tend to, you know, probably espouse the same kind of
I don't know.
perception. We don't know this. We don't know if there's any kind of coordination between the two groups.
I can say that
there's a great deal of coordination between AIPAC and evangelicals. I mean, you know, because let's face it, evangelicals have been advocating for Israel and for, you know, the whole land of Palestine being Israel. You know, the West Bank, they call the West Bank Judea and Samaria, you know, and so on. Because that's in the essence of their belief, you know. So, but we don't know whether there is actually a connection between ICS and evangelical groups. Well, this has really been most fascinating. I mean, I will definitely learn a great deal from this. I know you spoke about the SOL in all 50 states. What about the District of Columbia? What about the District?
That I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So we don't know what
but I do know that the SOLs in Maryland are very, very good. And if you compare and contrast the curriculum from Maryland with the curriculum of Virginia, it's day and night. I've been on
in what sense?
In the
Maryland is the state that I live in. I'm from Maryland.
Well, in the sense that they teach they teach history differently. They teach it thematically. So it's a deep dive and understanding into history. They contextualize it. In other words, in Virginia, it's chronological.
Yeah.
But in Maryland, it's thematic. So they would put a theme revolutions.
Yeah.
And they would dive deep into revolutions.
Yeah.
And all the components of revolution. And then, of course, the revolution, the name and the dates and all are swept into that one theme. But we know as teachers, that is best practice to teach thematically, because that's where you can pull all the information in. So we really like Maryland, and Virginia's got a long way to go.
I promise this will be my last question.
Okay.
All right. Now, are these SOL are they conducted yearly, the SOL meetings? Are they conducted only when there's new textbooks to be launched and so on? In Virginia's case, every 7 years. Are they done monthly? Is it done at a town hall meeting-like situation? How is it conducted? How could people participate? I'm saying if somebody wants to go and attend one of these meetings, if they can, is it possible?
Yes, it is. They have public hearings twice during the review process.
Okay. All right.
And you can expect it every 7 years. I believe it's codified. I believe it is in Virginia code that it has to be every 7 years. And yes, you can stand up and speak at a public hearing, and you can also write in. There are 2 parts in the review process to do that.
Well, this has been most fascinating. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Definitely we will aspire to learn a great deal from your presentation and you know, try to spread it as much as possible. And with that, you know, if I don't have any more questions to ask you, I will turn you over to Firas, and I hope that we could get together once again soon.
I'm going to send you those SOL, Saeed. I'm going to send you those ones.
All right. Can you hear me, Jeanne?
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. But as Saeed has said, it's a great deal of information. It's good to know, and thank you and everybody with you doing this research. It helps us as Arabs, immigrants here, to know how they're trying to change the narrative. But I think with people like you doing this work, we try to change the narrative and spread our story to the West. But it is interesting how, like in the SOLs, and how they, for example, mentioned Arab terrorists, but not Oklahoma 1995 bombings. How they try to change the narrative, but I believe that is changing in our in a good way of spreading unbiased information, stuff that will help us for the liberation of Palestine and the Arab people, hopefully in the future, and spreading the right information. But it's good information to know, and thank you very, very much for joining us here today and spreading what you have found out throughout your research.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you everybody for joining us live today. If you have missed or joined late or were not able to continue, this will be posted on our YouTube channel with some information as well.